Hello, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, where we are looking at the church records. Now, I slightly oddly here can't see myself, so can someone tell me that they can see it and that it's working before I persevere and realise that it's not working? That's fab. I've got it. Awesome. Nice to see you in a manner of speaking, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. First of all, just to say thank you for everybody's participation last week. We've had so far about 4,000 views of the Rose Street Foundry talk, so that's really appreciated. I'm glad that you enjoyed it and found things to get from it. I've had contact from people who study engineering, I've had contact from people who are in the family, and so it was the Hunter Gordon family. So it was really, really nice to see all of those comments coming in. So thank you. So as I said, this week we're looking at church records. So I thought I would start initially by saying where we get records from, because quite often people say, how do you get records? Where do you find them? One pupil from Inches Primary School said to me, do you just dig them up? And I was like, oh, bless. Not all things live under, old things come from under the ground. But, you know, good archaeology knowledge. So I thought I would explain how we get the church records, because it's a slightly different story. A lot of our records come to us through the Highland Council because we're a local authority archive. So things like the school records, property records, things like that come to us from the local authority. Church records are a little bit different. Some of them come to us under what's called charge and superintendence. This means that the National Records of Scotland, who are the national governing body of archives in Scotland, have approved that we are a suitable service to hold them, a suitable building to hold the records in. So after the Church of Scotland, which is the established church in Scotland, the main national denomination, when they are finished with their records, they give them to the National Records of Scotland. The National Records of Scotland then either keeps hold of them or passes them back to local areas. So in 2010, at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, we received about 1,000 volumes of church records back from Edinburgh. So we, as I've said previously, we have 4 offices in the Highland Archive Service, one in Inverness, one in Fort William, one in Portree, and one in Wick. So 2 of the 4 of those currently have their church records back. The others, it may be that they're in Edinburgh and maybe that they don't exist, but you can certainly get in touch with us. We would be able to advise about that. So that's how we get the established church records, the Church of Scotland. We also, through that method, get what are called the Secession churches records, which is the free churches that rejoined the Church of Scotland. We hold those. We don't hold the Free Church official records. They are still held by the Free Church. Then there are what's called non-conformist churches. So that's things like the Methodist, congregational churches, Episcopal churches, things like that. And they come to us through private deposit. So sometimes a specific church will give their records to us, and sometimes they come as part of family papers, or you know, if a minister has got private papers, that we might get records of the church through that. So it was just to give you an idea initially. I'm quite sure none of you thought that we dug them up, but it's always good to clarify. One thing, excuse me, one thing I will just hesitate to advertise while I'm here, sorry, is that we, as I said, hold a lot of Church of Scotland records of Secession churches, of Episcopalian, things like that. What we don't hold a lot of is other denominations and other religions. So if any of you who are watching are in a position that you want to contact us about that, if you belong to a church or a religious body of any religion that we don't hold records for, then we would love to hear from you, because our role is to represent the people of the Highlands. And if we don't hold all of those things, then we're not fairly representing everybody. So if you're in a position that you can speak to us about that, we would really appreciate that, so that we can tell your story as well. The church records are very wide-ranging. For instance, the Church of Scotland records that we have date from 1632 onwards. The Free Church records, the churches that came back into the Church of Scotland, date from 1843 onwards. That was the year that the Free Church was formed. The Methodist records we hold for Inverness date from the 1700s. So a wide range of dates, and as I say with every subject, it really depends on what's survived, who's kept things, how they've been kept. Quite often things find their way into the attics of school teachers, ministers, session clerks, and I can hold my hands up guiltily and say that we found some Kirk Session records in my mum and dad's attic not that long ago, because my dad was a session clerk. So it happens, and those are now on their way to Edinburgh to be added to the Church of Scotland collections before being returned to us in Inverness. So they cover a wide range of dates. The one thing I will say is that they have a closure period on them, so the last 30 years of records will not be accessible, and that's just because they list things like session clerk and elder's name and address, things like that, contact details, and so that's just to protect people. So I'm talking a lot about the church records, so possibly you're wondering what they consist of. I'm going to talk predominantly about the collections we hold in Inverness, because that's by far the largest collection, and I'm going to talk predominantly about the Church of Scotland records, but I will bring in some others. That's just because, to be representative, that's the biggest collection that we have. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Church of Scotland setup, the General Assembly sits at the top. That's the national lawmaking body for the church. That's the one you'll see on the news every year when they meet, although not this year because they weren't able to. So that's the national body, the General Assembly. Beneath that were synods. Currently, in England, there are still synods that aren't in Scotland. They were abolished in the Church of Scotland in 1993. So anytime you hear about a synod on the church, that tends to be on the news. Sorry, that tends to be the Church of England. Beneath the synod level, which is a kind of regional level, below that there's the presbyteries. The presbyteries are made up of the ministers and a representative elder from the Kirk Sessions, which is the lowest level of the church courts. So the Kirk Sessions are the local level. That's your local church. That's the elders and minister from that group. They then feed into the presbyteries, who did feed into the synods but don't anymore, who feed into the General Assembly, and that's the hierarchy of the Church of Scotland. The General Assembly records are held in Edinburgh at the National Records, because obviously they're a national body. But below that, the synods, the presbyteries and the Kirk Sessions are held in local archives like ours. If you're interested in church records, but not from a Highland point of view, then I would recommend that you have a look on the National Records of Scotland website. You can search on their catalogues and it will tell you all the church records that they hold. It will also tell you church records that exist in other archives. So if they have given them back like they have with us, it'll tell you that, so you'll get to know where they are. So what type of records are they? There are some, I'm going to go straight in with burial registers and say straight away there are not many of them. So if you're looking for a burial register, there really are not very frequently found. We only have 2 or 3 out of that 1,000 volumes. There are baptismal rolls, communicants rolls, proclamation registers. So these are things governing the actions of the church with regards to individuals. So things like when people are baptized, when people get married, who's the list of members, things like that can be found within them. But the vast majority of the records that we hold, and the ones that I'm going to really talk about mostly, are the minutes. Now, every time we talk to people about church minutes, people think they sound really dull. They are not dull at all. I can't overemphasize this enough. Church minutes, Kirk Sessions, presbyteries are phenomenally interesting. It's very interesting to note that what's not mentioned very often in them is God. The Bible rarely gets mentioned. Generally, what's mentioned is money, people, and people doing things wrong. But I'll come back to that in a second. They can include things like accounts. They can include one of the Methodist records we've got is an accounts book that lists candles and hymn books, things like that in 1770s. And then at the back of the book, there's a poem written by the minister saying how sorry he feels for poor Inverness and how much God is needed in Inverness. So you can find surprising things in church records. They have a lot of uses. people use them a lot for family history research. And for instance, I've got this to show you again, as always. I know you won't be able to read it, but I'll tell you what it says. This is an extract from a Kirk Session minute from my own family. This is from 1932, and it says, this is a memorial minute prepared to be inserted into the Kirk Session minutes. And it says, Mr. William Ramsay, whose death took place on the 4th of December 1931 at the ripe age of 81, has been an elder of this congregation for over 44 years, and his presence will be greatly missed. He has been called to higher service and leaves behind him a fine record of Christian work and a fragrant memory that will linger long in the hearts of all those with whom he came into contact. And it goes on. That is my great-great-grandfather. So obviously you can find references to your family members in things like baptism records, in proclamation records which show marriages, things like that. But also if you have a family member who is involved in the church a lot, you can find something like this, which tells, gives a memorial to them, to that person. And that's a really nice thing to have. The other things that can be found from a family history point of view within those records are things like, there's an excellent communicants roll which lists the members in Nairn Congregational Church that we have from the 1800s, and it records everybody who's left the church. So there's a list of everybody who's members, but then next to it it'll say they've emigrated to America, they've gone to New Zealand, they've moved from this village to another village, and things like that. So it's worth having a look in them if you're trying to fill a gap in your family history. The other thing they're very good for, particularly the minutes, are for just getting context of what somebody's life was like. If you don't get a specific mention of an ancestor, you'll get some context of what their life was like. And that happened to us a while ago, where someone came in to research and couldn't work out why her family had gone to America. And just reading the local Kirk Session record, she said, she came up to us at the desk and said, there was a huge famine locally, all the crops had failed, and they report in the Kirk Session that hundreds of people are leaving. So that'll be why my family left. That's the context that they left this country in. So they're useful for that. We also have a lot of people come into research with us in the Kirk Session records about things like the role of equality. How much are women mentioned in the Kirk Session records? Finding out about Telford manses, so you can see who, which churches had Telford manses built or churches built. David Worthington, who may or may not be watching. David, if you're watching, say hello. Who is the head of the history department at the University of the Highlands and Islands, has used our Kirk Session records to research ferries and coastal trade in the Highlands, to see there's references to boats and people travelling, things like that. So you can find out all sorts of information. They have a lot of contextual information about life in them. So what I'm going to do is give you some extracts from the 1600s, 1700s, 18 and 1900s, just so that you can see some of the sorts of things that are found in these awesome records. One thing it's important to bear in mind is the extent of power and influence that the church has had in our history. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the church was the governing body on so many subjects and the final word. So they had control over poor relief, so they would assist anybody who was needy, as it was called. They had control over education in the parish. They had control over morals and discipline and behaviour. And also there was a very high attendance in church throughout most of Scottish history. So the church has a huge influence and a huge power in people's lives for several hundred years across the Highlands and wider across Scotland. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. Sometimes when I speak to school groups, they struggle to get their head around that a little bit, because to them, either they don't go to church at all, or church is somewhere that they go, one morning a week with granny or something like that. For an older generation, or for someone like me who grew up in a church family, it makes sense to me. I know the background of the church history and that authority, but sometimes people don't know that. So it's worth bearing in mind. So I wanted to start in the 1600s, and I've got a couple of extracts to read to you. So you'll have to bear with me. I am unusually going to look from side to side, and that's because I wanted to write the extracts out in full, because me trying to put them in modern phraseology is just not as awesome as when you read it. I know I say awesome every week. I am working on it. So 1600s, I've got an extract for you from Inverness and Bona Kirk Session from 1688, and it records the payment of 10 Scots merks, so that was a denomination of money that was only in Scotland, and it's to Alexander Sutherland, the master of the grammar school, as part payment owed to him by the session for his chamber rent. So the only reason I'm highlighting that one is just to show that that's the church controlling education in Inverness. They're paying for the teachers' wages. They will also have appointed him. They'll decide whether he's up to the job or not, whether he's teaching the way they want him to teach. And if not, they have the power to just put him out. And when we come to the 1800s, you'll see an example of that happening. An exciting one for me, 1650 from the Presbytery of Dingwall. So if you remember, the Kirk Session or the local level, the Presbytery are the next court up. And this is something that has obviously happened at a Kirk Session meeting, but has been deemed to be so serious that it's been moved up and taken to the Presbytery meeting to be discussed. And this says, Margaret Dow was summoned for sorcery by burying a lamb under her threshold. She was called, appeared, acknowledged the guilt alleged, affirming that she did it only in simplicity, by the information of a poor woman that came to her house as a preventative against the death of the rest of her animals. So that just goes to show 1650, what's that, in 400, nearly 400 years ago, the level of naivety, superstition. She's frightened of losing her animals, which will be her lifeline, either her income or just her own sustenance. And she's so frightened that she'll lose other animals that this lady has come around and said, why don't you bury the lamb under your doorway, and that will protect all the other animals and none of the others will die. And so she's done that, and in doing that has been called up in front of the Kirk Session and then the Presbytery to be disciplined for sorcery, as they word it. The church had a huge amount of sway over things like this. This is based on the books of discipline, and what they're doing is observing their congregation, their community, and because there's such a high attendance level, other people are watching other people as well and reporting and saying, did you see that Mrs. Dow did that? She buried a lamb under her threshold last night. We better tell the church. So there's quite a, not oppressive, but there's quite a heavy culture, I think, of people watching other people and reporting. So that was 1650. If we move on to 1730s, this extract is from Golspie Kirk Session up in Sutherland. I'm saying up. If you're watching in Caithness, it's down in Sutherland. Up for me. This is an extract from Golspie. So, at a meeting of the Kirk Session of Golspie on the 21st of November, 1732, it was reported to the session that Elspeth Buie, alias Ross, in Kilmally, having a child that was seized with a convulsion fit, in order to cure the child, digged a hole in the ground and put therein a living cockerel, in the manner of some sacrifice. And the said Elspeth, being cited to this deed, and appearing, was interrogated concerning the facts laid to her charge, and she answered that she confessed she did put a living fowl under the ground, having seen it as a practicable custom among some of the vulgar to use such a mean in order to remove convulsion fits from persons seized. So she admits that she has buried this cockerel in the ground, but she said she's done it because she believes it can heal her child. And I think it's a very it's quite a powerful little extract, that, because I just think you can see the desperation of a person going, I don't know how to heal my child, I'll try this. So it goes on to say, the session, finding it necessary to expose publicly the heinousness of such wicked practice, which in effect they concluded to be gross idolatry or sacrifice to the devil, did appoint the said Elspeth to appear before the congregation to confess and be reprehended for her uncommon crime. Elspeth refused to go in front of the public, in front of the congregation, and admit what she'd done. So she gets summoned to the next court, the Presbytery. And whatever they said to her there must have worked, because on the 23rd of April, 1733, so 5 or 6 months later, the Kirk Session says, Elspeth Buie stood in sackcloth for 5 days, and being sharply rebuked for her crime and seriously exhorted to repentance, was absolved. So her option there is to either stand in front of the congregation and tell them how wicked she is and what she's done, or to stand in sackcloth for 5 days. Any of you who are watching on Crime and Punishment Week, it's interesting. It's a useful place to look for crime records, the church records, because, as I said, we forget sometimes how much authority they had over that area. Other things being traced in the 1700s, just a little bit lighter-hearted than Elspeth Buie and her poor child. This one is from Cawdor, so just outside Nairn, 1719. This one dates from. William Campbell, formerly guilty of fornication with, and there's a blank to protect the lady's name, which is unusual, and of late guilty into relapse of the same crime, has been summoned to this meeting. He appeared, and having confessed his sin, was sharply rebuked and appointed to appear before the congregation the next Lord's Day to publicly profess his repentance. We read a surprising amount about fornication in our jobs. The church, there's a lot of references in the church records to what's called uncleanness, fornication, relationships out of wedlock. If any of you are researching your family and have come across an illegitimate birth, church records are a great place to look for that. Usually there will be a record early, not obviously recently, but in the early records there's quite often a reference to an illegitimate birth, or to the people who are called in front of the Kirk session to discuss what they've done. So just something to bear in mind. Another one from the 1700s for you is from Kirkhill. Now, I read this to somebody not that long ago who just went, oh, it's still like that in Kirkhill. So if anyone is watching from Kirkhill, which for those of you out with Highland is just over the Keswick Bridge and north a bit from Inverness, let me know if it's still like this in Kirkhill. So this is from 1779. It was represented to the session that there was a fearful breach of Sabbath in the parish, and if Providence had not ordered that some had been later in going to bed that evening than ordinary, it was believed that corpses might have been found on their doorsteps, particularly the corpse of James Fraser, for he, Kenneth Roy, Robert McAllister, Elspeth Bain, Janet McThomas, and Mary Roy, having crossed the ferry of Beaulieu and returning late that evening towards Drumchardon, went into the house of John Urquhart, shoemaker at Newton, and drank ale and aquavita until they were so intoxicated that many of them looked as though their clothes had been dragged with dubs and clay as if they had been drawn through the mud. So we like that one, but I wouldn't dare suggest that that's what Kirkhill is still like. So that's just some of the ideas of stories that there are to do with discipline and people doing things wrong as it was seen at the time and being pulled up in front of the local church or the presbytery for discipline. Another thing I wanted to just draw your attention to was moving on a little bit from that same century, but a much wider subject, and that's the Jacobite risings. I know that I have talked a few times about the Jacobite risings because it's a very particular favourite subject of mine, but in the 1700s, this was a huge national and international event that was going on, and the church had a lot to say about it. And I think sometimes people wouldn't realise that if they looked in the minutes of their local church, they might find contemporary evidence of the Battle of Culloden, of Jacobite risings. Any of you who have been in the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness will have seen possibly my Jacobite boards that tell the story of the 1715 uprising. Any of you who work closely with me will know I keep threatening to take them home and decorate my house with them because I'm so proud of them. But one of my favourite church records is included on those boards, and it's an extract from Dornoch Presbytery from 1716. It talks about the 15 Rising had been going on. It had just kind of died down, January 1716, and Dornoch Presbytery have met to discuss this. And they record that they feel the Jacobite risings are a reflection on how badly behaved the country has begun, how much the country is turning away from God. And they warn and they want to put in writing to their congregation that they feel that if this is not suppressed, that the devouring sword of God will come through the country, and that before long Scotland will become a field of blood. I find that such a powerful piece of writing, because 30 years later, this is what happened in the Battle of Culloden, that the country was split down the lines of religion and became a field of blood, effectively. I just find that a very, very powerful statement. So the church, the established church, Church of Scotland, very much against the Jacobite risings. As I said in Jacobite Week, it's very much a religious conflict. And so the church is on the side of the Hanoverians and the government. And so there are various extracts that talk about it. Abernethy Presbytery has an extract from August 1745 that said, "The brethren have had a report that the Pretender's oldest son has landed in the Highlands, and that some of the disaffected clans are already in arms to promote his designs." They said that they thought it was their duty to spend the time in prayer, having a particular regard for the state of the nation, and they resolved to warn the people of the danger of civil war and horrid rebellion. When you've grown up studying things like the Battle of Culloden, it's really, really interesting to open those books and go, this was written right there at the time. Bonnie Prince Charlie had just landed, and they're already discussing what they're going to do about it. One extract from Killarnan Kirk Session in Ross and Cromarty was found by my colleague Debbie with great excitement. I got a phone call at home going, "Guess what I found? Guess what I found?" And I'm going to read it to you. It's from the 21st of April, 1746. And this is 1 week after the Battle of Culloden, which again is quite extraordinary to think about, that you're holding something that somebody wrote just 1 week after that huge event had happened. So it says, "The moderator highlights the possibility of returning to normal by means of the victory obtained by His Royal Highness over the rebel army at Culloden on Wednesday last. Yet he was sorry that the madness and folly of some in this parish in joining with the rebels had made them obnoxious, so that when many of the neighbouring parishes are already enjoying peace and tranquillity, this is far from the case in Killarnan." He goes on to say that his reason for calling the session meeting that day is that a party of the Earl of Sutherland's men have been detached from Beaulieu and have had orders from the Duke of Cumberland to take up the persons and effects of the rebels in this parish. So they're going to seize any rebels unless they can provide a certificate to show their innocence. And so they agree to meet with the Duke of Sutherland's men, the Earl of Sutherland's men, and issue certificates. So just interesting to see that you can see the impact of huge national and international effects through the church records. As we move into the 1800s, we start to see the church becoming still involved, but you see the state starting to step in with the Poor Relief Acts, in 1845 Poor Relief Act, with the 1872 Education Act. You start to see the state taking over some of the functions that the church had been carrying out. But I wanted to just chat quickly about one story from the 1800s. I mentioned it at the beginning, and it's about a schoolmaster. And this is from Hugh Fraser, about Hugh Fraser, who's a schoolmaster in Kirkhill. In 1824, the school had a review, and the local area wrote a sparkling review about his ability to teach. The children were well educated, they could read, they could answer their Bible lessons. Now, you'll know, if you've been watching from previous weeks, this is before the Education Act, so this is before there was a state-run school. This is still a school being run by the church. So there's a report of the school saying that it's very well run and that he's a very good teacher. And that's 1824. By 1828, something had happened which has upset his relationship with the local landowners. And they say that he's guilty of leading an immoral life and that he's filling his pupils' minds with unsound doctrine. So whatever he's teaching them is not quite biblically correct, they think. And so they recommend that he was removed and that he's banned from taking communion. He took his fight to the Kirk session and said how important it was to him to be allowed to take communion. They said no. He took it to Inverness Presbytery. They said no. He took it to the Synod of Moray. They said no. And he took his fight to the General Assembly at national level. And at every level, his request to take communion was denied. They found him guilty of all sorts of bad behaviour, including coughing during the sermon, which they said was deliberate and designed to disturb the minister. He then was going on through the years, was forcibly ejected from several communion services, including one in 1835, where he held up his Bible. And I can completely visualize this. He held up his Bible in the church and said, "This Bible alone gives me the right to take communion in this church. I believe this Bible, and therefore I am entitled to take communion." But they said no. 1838, so by now this has been going on for 10 years, they admitted him into the church and said he could sit through a communion service, but he wasn't allowed to take the bread and wine. And as the communion cup passed him by, he snatched it and tried to take a drink from it. I think that shows his desperation to be part of the church community. He was arrested for doing this and charged with breach of the peace, profanity, and illegally disturbing the congregation. So this now then moves from being a church matter in the church courts to becoming a civil court matter. He goes to the High Court. They found him not guilty of breach of the peace and profanity, but they did find him guilty of illegally disturbing the congregation, and as a result, all his movable goods were seized by the Crown. Quite a substantial punishment. I obviously wasn't there. I don't know the truth of the story. I don't know what had happened between him and the Heritors to cause the problem. But it's really interesting to me that in amongst the papers that talk about this court, there is a statement from 1833 that was signed by over 130 heads of the household in Kirkhill parish. Now, Kirkhill parish it's not enormous. That 130 households signing this would be quite substantial. And they're all signing it to say that apart from the one initial dispute with the Heritors, the landowners, they had found Hugh Fraser to have an exceptional and irreproachable moral character. So as I say, I don't know what the truth of that is, but it's just another interesting example of the sort of things you can find in Kirk Session records and the stories that are in there. Moving on just to the 1900s, I'm aware that we're at half an hour, so I'll not keep you too much longer. Just a continuation of the same thing. The church is no longer they're no longer people making the decisions, but they're still influencing them. They're still heavily involved in those conversations. I think if I was to look into it, which I haven't, I would imagine that the church regular membership probably started to go down after the wars. I'm not sure, but I would guess that would be round about when that could be dated from. But throughout the wars, you can see the church having a commentary on national and international events, and also a very, very important role at this time of comfort, support, looking after people as they're going through something very traumatic. For instance, the Invergordon Free Church records, and as I say, that's the Free Church that came back into the Church of Scotland. There's an extract in there from beginning of the war, 1916, I think, that talks about how they're having to put on more and more additional communion services because of the naval base at Invergordon. They said the level of fear of the people who are coming to serve here and then having to leave for the front. We're putting on more and more extra communion services so that these people are leaving to go to the front, having had communion and having been prayed with to take some of that fear away from them. So you start to see the church stepping into those kind of comforting, supportive, mentoring roles. Another extract from Invergordon, but this time from the Episcopal Church, St Minian's, which is one of the collections, as I said at the beginning, that we have deposited with us. There's a letter in there from 1919 where the governing body of the church wrote to the bishop of the diocese to protest the proposed closing of the dockyard and the naval base by the Admiralty. they're saying this will have a huge impact on the church and on the community. So you see the church starting to take over those sorts of roles and being involved in the local community in a more supportive fashion. There are extracts going right through, obviously, to present day. We have church records that come up to the present day. And there are some that from the Second World War talking about the blackout and things like that. But I wanted to finish by going back a little bit and talking just about two more extracts from the First World War, because I think they're particularly powerful. One of them is very, very current and relevant, and it is, again, from St. Ninian's, from St. Ninian's Episcopal Church, Invergordon. And it reads, it was written in 1919, so in the peak, 1819, of the Spanish flu epidemic. And they write, "It is now known that Mr. Thomas contracted his fatal illness while ministering to the many sick persons who came under his care through this epidemic of influenza now prevailing. Had he thought more of himself and less of others, he might have been with us still, but it may truly be said of him that, like a good shepherd, he laid down his life for his flock." I think that is a very powerful sentence and something that any minister would be proud to have written about him. And it's, as I say, it's very current. And 100 years ago, they were going through a flu epidemic where hundreds of thousands of people were dying, and they were trying to keep it under control. And people were going out serving their community and giving their lives through that service, which of course is something we're seeing just now as well. And the final one I wanted to tell you about was an extract from Kingussie Kirk Session. Kingussie, the Kirk Session records include typed newsletters written by the minister, and they're stuck into the handwritten Kirk Session records. And the extract I wanted to share with you was written throughout the First World War, written by the minister who was serving as a chaplain on the front. And he writes home to the congregation, "You can't imagine what I'm seeing here. You can't imagine what I'm seeing on a daily basis, what's happening to the young men out here. So you can't imagine it, and I hope you never can imagine it." He said, "But the only thing is, I don't know." He said, "Question yourselves about whether we're worthy of this. Do we have the gratitude we should have? People are giving their lives left, right, and centre and are going through horrendous suffering. Are you being worth the sacrifice? Think about it." He says, if you're sitting at home complaining about very small things, then you're misunderstanding the scale of what is happening here and what is being laid down for you. I think that's an extraordinary thing to think about. And again, to some extent, quite current. Anyway, I'm sorry to end that on at such a low note. I hope that we've shown that the Kirk Session records and all the different church collections we hold are really fascinating. They're full of stories about all sorts of subjects. So I really hope when things are a bit more back to normal, you can come in and see some of them, or let us know if you're interested in any of them. We'll let you know which areas we hold. So please do contact us about that. I hope you can join us next week. Next week we're looking at Tales from the Asylum, and so far 600 people have expressed interest in attending. So I'm expecting that there'll be a few people involved in next week's one. So I'll see you next week. Thank you.